Uniforms are made.
You can't put words to how important kids are.
Dennis Uniform was founded in 1920.
You want their lives to be full of love. You want them to be smart and successful and confident. It's my job as a teacher to make it all happen, and I do it every day as best I possibly can. But still, you try to think of every little detail. They're worth it. After a while, you forget that you're their teacher. You become like a parent, and they become your family.
Welcome to this NCEA 2021 live session entitled What Assessment Data Tells Us About the Academic Impacts of COVID-19 Disruptions. Our presenter is Dr. Jean Kearns from Renaissance. We invite you to actively engage with this presentation using the messaging and questions function in the event platform. At the conclusion of the session, you will have the opportunity to complete a post-session evaluation and provide feedback that will also track your participation in our sessions. If you run into any problems, we invite you to refresh your page or use the help section on the event platform. Thank you for being here, and now we turn it over to Dr. Jean Kearns.
Thank you, Sterling, and thank you, Josh, and thanks for everybody for attending. Glad to be here with you today. I'm excited to be with you because we're going to get some additional insights about what all of these disruptions are doing to students in an academic sense. So some of you may already have had an overview of our How Kids Are Performing report, which was released back in the first part of November. And I'm excited today to give you an update, to give you a preview of the winter edition, which is being worked on right now. And so some of the information that I'm going to offer to you today, you will be some of the first people in the country to see what we found about growth during the course of this academic year. So this is, and I'll only be able to share part of it because it's just being finished up right now. But I am excited to share this with you because it gives us a better picture of what is really happening as we make our way through this year and what are these disruptions doing to students' academic progress. Let's get started. At Renaissance, we always like to, let me get the right click, there we go. We always like to begin by acknowledging our mission, which succinctly stated is to accelerate learning for all. And what we find as one of the world's largest assessment providers is often we have the information necessary to answer some really important research questions, such as what is the nature of the COVID slide or the pandemic impact, or what is the extent of learning loss, whatever preferred term that you have for the academic impacts of COVID. So in a typical year, it's been a while since we had one of those. In a typical year, students around the world take typically about 80 plus million STAR assessments, STAR reading, STAR math, and STAR literacy. And even though testing was down somewhat over the last 2 years, we still are getting millions of test records. And so what I'm going to show you is the mining of those millions of interim test records to reveal what the nature of the COVID slide is. And this is important because with the state and national tests around the country offline, we have not been able to see information from there. And of course, formative assessment tools are critically important at the classroom level, but they do not produce nationally normed scores, and therefore they could not answer the question for us about the nature or the extent of the COVID slide in a normed sense. So it is really from interim assessments like STAR that we're getting some peeks at what's going on. Now, I have the URL up here for the report. I encourage you to go there if you've not already seen the report. And again, for those of you that have, I'm only going to do a quick review of what is there in the fall edition of the report, and then most of our time is going to be updating you about the winter edition. But if you've not seen this report already, I would encourage you to go to renaissance.com/performing and to do two things. First of all, download the report because it's got some great information about what we knew to be the nature of the COVID slide as school began. And again, we'll see some updates to that. But the other thing that I would encourage you to do and we'll come back to this slide a little bit later, is I would encourage you to bookmark this URL so that you can come back to it later, because we are putting additional editions of the report there. We're putting all sorts of resources there. So we do hope that it will be sort of a go-to place for you as we all make our way through all of these disruptions. Now, a couple of things. There are some other reports out there that have also done this work of quantifying the COVID slide. So I think it's important that you understand how this report is either like those or different from them. First of all, there were some early reports back last spring that were just predictions or projections. That is not what this is. This is actually using back to school data. So we've done this work. I know that some of our competitors in the field have done similar reports as well. So we're all using that back to school data. But there are two things that make this report perhaps different from some of the others. First of all, it is the largest. 5.3 million student records involved in this report. The second largest report out there is about 4.1 million. So really, really robust sample. And the other thing that makes this report different also relates to its sample. We had data from students from all 50 states and the District of Columbia, which makes this both the first and to date only national report in that the students involved in the analysis came from all 50 states and DC. Some of our competitors were a little bit smaller in scale. They didn't necessarily have all the states there. So this really, we believe, is a very realistic picture of what's happening around the country because of a huge sample size. So let me kind of explain to you what we're trying to do in measuring the COVID impact. I'll show you what we learned in the fall, and I will give you that preview to what we're learning in the winter analysis right now. So let's sort of think about it graphically. If you look at the blue line here, this sort of represents what would academic growth look like for kids had we not had a pandemic. We know historically how kids were growing. We project if they continue to grow at that rate, what it would look like. We would have had some fairly normal growth across this time period running from the fall of 2019 up until the winter of 2020, which is we're able to analyze right now. But of course, there was a pandemic. So we've drawn a dotted line in there. Phase 1, pre-pandemic. Phase 2, during the pandemic. And the first report that came out, the one that we released last November, that looked at the period between those first two dotted lines to say, blue line, we know historically how kids were growing. How did kids actually grow between the spring of last year and the beginning of the current year that we were in? Of course, you know, we hit March, and in a period of just a couple of weeks, basically every school in the country went offline. And so what was the impact? And so that first report studied the period between those two dotted lines. And basically what we saw, no surprise to anybody, is there was overall a drop in performance. Certain subject areas were more impacted. We'll get a quick review of that. And certain grade levels were more impacted. We will get that. But everybody was expecting, and indeed there was, a disruption to academic progress. And of course, what we then all are saying is the gap between those two represents COVID's impact. This is the COVID slide. This is the academic impact of what is going on. So let's get ready to respond to just a couple of questions. You can use your chat feature for this. I want to ask you a couple of questions, and if you'll enter your response, and then I'll call upon Sterling and Josh to be my eyes and ears and bring that information over to me. But first of all, what do you think is going to be the most impacted area? Now, we are able to report on both reading and mathematics. And my question to you is, which of those two subject areas do you believe that potentially would be the most impacted due to most recent COVID disruptions? Now, I'll be interested to hear the results here, because it used to be that I'd get a very mixed response, and I'm seeing that a little bit less and less, probably because some of these reports have been out there. But Sterling and Josh, can you let me know, what are folks saying? Do they think it's reading, or do they think it's math that's taken a harder hit in all of this? And I'm seeing some responses there in chat. And basically what we're seeing is what I expected, math. Now, if I'd asked this question like 6 months ago, I got that very mixed response. Some people said reading, some people said math, but basically this is what the multiple reports that have all been exploring this, they've all found, generally speaking, in an overall sense, Math is more impacted than reading, but let's ask a little bit harder question. What grade ranges do you think experience the hardest impact? Do you think that it's K-2, those first couple of grades of elementary school, or is it the late elementary school grades of 3 to 5? Is it the middle years of grades 6 through 8, or is it the high school years of grades 9 through 12? Now, my guess is this is probably where we will see some more mixed results here. But who do you think took the hardest hit? K-2, 3 to 5, 6 to 8, or 9 to 12? Let's see perhaps what we're seeing there. Now, some folks had predicted, and that's what this is all about, predictions versus realities in some ways. There were a lot of earlier predictions that said K-2, and I'm seeing that a number of you are still responding K-2. And I think that's based on this idea that in K-2, we're laying the foundations, particularly for reading, and laying the foundations for math. And so a lot of people predicted that. In just a minute, we will see whether that is the reality or not, because clearly all grades have been impacted, but some grades have been hit a little bit more. So just a quick review of what we learned looking at the fall data, and then I'll show you the brand new data that almost nobody has seen outside of Renaissance just yet, but it does warrant a quick review of what we released in the first edition of the report. We're looking at reading. We are only able to do this analysis for grades 1 through 8. We cannot do the high school. The reasons why it's reported in the report. It's a very different sample size there. So we could report on grades 1 through 8. And basically what we saw in reading was some degree of impact. On average, students started this year about 1 percentile rank lower than typically or what we would have expected. The easiest way to interpret this table is to simply look at that far right column and look at the numbers there. So overall, down about 1 percentile point, many grade levels that are down about 2 percentile points. And I'm sure your eyes were drawn to these odd numbers here where it looks like students in grades 1, 2, and 3 may be up some. Anytime that you see these grade ranges, there's going to be a note attached to it that says, interpret these grades with some degree of concern because we don't know to what extent these scores might not be inflated because many students were potentially taking these assessments remotely. And so the new analysis that is just about to come out has solved this dilemma. And what we did indeed find was, nope, didn't really look like this. This wasn't completely realistic. Probably more in the neighborhood of like these other grades were. So the good news is in reading is the drops were manageable. Like a 1 or 2 percentile point drop is something that we can work to overcome fairly quickly, but you already knew where the story goes. Math was significantly more impacted. Now, again, the reasons why are explained in the methodology section here, but we were only able to do the analysis for grades 2 through 8. And what we found in that analysis was that when we look across those grades, overall students are down about 7 percentile points, with some grades being impacted a bit more. Grades 4 and 5, for example, down 10 percentile points, closely followed by grades 3 and grade 6 at -8. Basically drops in math across the board, with the hardest hit coming to the late grades of elementary school, grades 4 and grade 5. So that is what we learned as of the fall. Here's one more finding of the fall, and this is where between the fall and the winter, there's been some really significant shifts in what's happening to kids around the country. But here's how things stacked up in the fall. If we were to look at how the variance in percentile rank impact changes across different races and ethnicities, other characteristics such as students being with disabilities or English language learners, school location, type of school, and that's very relevant to you, basically public, non-public, and Title I, which is a really good proxy for family income. So here's the way that you read this table. Overall, here is the reading performance down 1 percentile point. Overall, in the light green, here is the math performance down about 7 percentile points. And then there are these dark boxes that represent each particular subgroup. And you can then very quickly see whether that subgroup is below the overall average or above it. Now, in terms of what we saw here, a lot of this is sadly what people expected. For example, what we see is high poverty schools experience more of a drop than their non-poverty school counterparts. And sadly, some students of certain races and ethnicities who often take the brunt of hits like this, they dropped a little bit more. So the bad news is there was some variance, but generally speaking, when you look at the average and you look at subgroups, at most they were about 2 percentile points behind the overall average. Perhaps the most interesting thing in here was this analysis that related to the location of the school. Was it in a rural or small town area, or was it more suburban or urban in nature? And what we saw was rural and small town schools tended to be more hard hit. They dropped more than their suburban and urban counterparts. Now, we don't know why, but one theory is that when you live in more rural and small town areas, bandwidth is an issue. And knowing how much many schools relied upon distance learning, it was really hard for students to perhaps connect in there, or even teachers to get online and do lessons. So that was the review. One last thing. These drops in performance, 8 to 10 to 12, or actually 8 to 10 in most cases, percentile points. How many weeks of instruction do you think it would take to catch kids up in those most impacted grades? Let's see if folks want to make some guesses there. Do you think it's 3 or less weeks, 4 to 7 weeks that we need to catch kids up from those kinds of gaps, 8 to 11 or 12 or more? And again, that would be grades 4 and 5 in math that were down 10 percentile points. How many weeks of a daily math class might we need to catch kids up from a drop of 10 percentile points? Let's see what folks think. If there's any feedback there, I know we have a little bit of a delay, so I want to fill airtime a little bit, but I don't want to bore you too much. I'll tell you, nobody thinks that it's these first two typically. These are really your choices here. And basically it comes to these two areas. The most impacted grades is 12 or more. And across many, many ranges, it's 8 to 11. There was a great question that came in a chat there. Does the research apply to schools that return to in-person schooling? You are looking at how kids started this year. And now we're about to transition into the new report where this question becomes very relevant. The new report is looking at what is happening nationwide. And of course, nationwide, there are some schools that have been very much in person and some schools that have been very much remote and everything in between. But this initial analysis, if you think about it, and this is a really important point, if you think about the experience that we all had from last March until the beginning of the year, it was fairly consistent that we were all out of school. So across the country, most of us shut the buildings down in last March in the middle of the month, and we did not go back in for schooling, which means across the country, it was a fairly uniform experience that kids were away from the buildings. But when we started this school year, there was a lot of variance. There was places where kids were back in, others where they didn't get in all that much, others where they went in and then they went back out. A lot of changes. Point being, from the spring to the start of the year, there wasn't a whole lot of variance in our experiences. But from the start of the school year until today, there has been tremendous variance. So again, this is what we found, typically 8 to 11 or 12 or more weeks for kids to catch up from these gaps. But that is, again, how we started the year. Let's get into the new data. Because in the end of this report, what we said was it's important to know where kids started this year, how far they were behind. But the next most important question is, how are kids growing this year? How much growth are we getting? Because if, for example, as you read this chart, if we know, for example, that overall students were about 8 to 11 weeks behind, if we don't move kids as quickly this year as we did before, then kids get further and further behind, and it takes more and more weeks to catch them up. So this next edition that is just about to come out is about growth this year. So let's go back to this chart. We know all of this so far. We know how kids historically grew. There's the blue line. We know what COVID did to us between the start of the pandemic and the back to school period. The next question, the next most important question is, how are kids growing this year? How does this line become extended? What do we see in terms of growth? And there are three options. It could be, as we look at this winter edition, which is now studying the next dotted lines, it could be that there's continued decline. That, we're making some growth this year, but it's not on par with normal, which means the gaps are actually getting worse. Or it could be that we're growing kids fairly legitimately, and we're having a legitimate year, but we're not moving in an above average rate, which means the gaps that were established are actually holding steady. And of course, what we would all like to see is that we're actually gaining ground, that we're moving quickly enough this year to close those gaps. But how realistic is that, given the disruptions that we've had? So this is what we all hope for. Let's see. And I'll let you know, in the winter edition, what we are seeing is a very mixed bag of the results. So we are actually seeing all three of these things. We are seeing grade levels where things are getting worse with certain subject areas. We are seeing some other subject areas and grade levels where we're having legitimate growth, but it's not fast enough to close any gaps, which means we're treading water and we're holding steady. And we are also seeing some grade levels and subject areas that are moving quickly enough to begin to close these gaps. So let's find out what is inside this mixed bag. And for Catholic schools, this is very relevant, because what I will tell you is there is some very good news about what is happening in Catholic schools, because as a general rule of thumb, students in Catholic schools are faring better than their public school counterparts. So the final work on this report is being done, so I cannot pull back these blue boxes down to the bottom to completely reveal them, because they're going through the triple check and the final summary here. But here is what we are overall seeing. Now, there's four options here about what's underneath those blue boxes. You would have reading at the elementary school level and reading at the middle school level. And you would have math also at the elementary school level and the middle school level. So those are your options: reading, elementary and middle; math, elementary and middle. Those are the four options. And I can tell you, in terms of what's happening, is there are two of those four where we are gaining ground. Okay, so of those four options, two of them, we are seeing very legitimate growth. In fact, such legitimate growth that the gaps are getting smaller. Of those four areas, we're also seeing one where things are holding steady. It's not getting any worse, but it's not getting any better. And sadly, one of those four, either reading at the elementary or middle school level, or math at the elementary or middle school level, in one of those four areas, we are seeing some decline where things are getting worse. Now, what I can generally say is this is for the entire population. The good news is, as a general rule of thumb for Catholic schools, you are at least holding steady in almost all areas and gaining ground in many areas. So here's the other part of the story. While there is some movement, while there's some holding steady, gaining ground, and falling behind, there are, and this is the really big difference between the spring into the fall and the fall into this school year, there are some really stark realities hiding behind those averages. In other words, the averages overall are not too bad, because we are moving ahead and holding steady in many areas, but there are some populations of kids, some demographics, where students are regressing or staying steady while their counterparts are moving ahead. So what we're actually seeing is we're seeing some widening of performance gaps, where things were fairly closely, clumped together in the fall. We are seeing the differences between many ethnic, racial, and demographic groups get wider during the course of this year. So let me go back to this chart. This was the chart from last fall. Okay, so you're not looking at the new data yet, but I wanted to show you this chart as a reference point, because again, these are the demographics that we are able to report on. This is what we're able to analyze. And you remember this one, we saw math overall, We saw reading overall in the light blue. We saw the different demographic groups. And what I pointed out is where the entire student population was down about 7 points, the most impacted subgroups were down 2 points more. So, 2 points below, a couple points below, you get an idea of the range. What we are seeing in the winter data is that this range is getting wider as some students move further ahead while some students move further behind. And so all of this is turning into an issue of equity and disparity. So let me show you or give you a little hint at what we're seeing, because again, the final analysis is being done, but let's zoom in. Let's just take, for example, racial and ethnic subgroups, okay? And this is a close-up of that very same chart that you saw before. So let me prepare you for what's going to be in the next edition of the report, which is due out in just a couple of weeks. What you will see is a chart very much like that, but we're going to add a couple of things to the chart. First of all, what we will do is we will draw a little F on each of the boxes that represented where students were in the fall. And then we're going to add more boxes to let you know where each subgroup is in the winter. Now, with so many subgroups, this can get a little bit confusing. So let's just use one as an example. So here is one particular demographic group. Okay, so you see the overall, let's use math as an average. You see overall, math was down about 7 percentile points. This particular ethnic group was at -8 percentile points, so just a little bit further behind than the overall average. That's where they were in the fall, but what's now important to know is where is that group as we got to the winter of the year? And for that particular group, here's what we found. They were at -5. Now this is good news because there's been movement to the right. They are not as far behind as they were in the fall. This is what we would hope for. We would hope that for every group, they are moving more to the right. They are less further behind. And so for this particular demographic group, they were 8 percentile points behind a level of expected performance year over year. By the winter, they're only 5 behind. That is movement to the right. That is good. But sadly, that does not happen for every group in our analysis. Let's use the second group as an example. They were 8 percentile points behind in the fall. What if we find that now as we get to the winter, they are now 9 percentile points behind, which is a drop of 1. And can you see it? Can you see the range as some groups moving up while some other groups moving down? This is the sad story of what we are finding in this winter analysis is there are all sorts of varying impact. Some kids are moving ahead, some kids are regressing. Let me give you a sense of the scale of this. In our analysis, these are the 16 demographic groups that we can report on. So you see the various race and ethnicities there. You see the characteristics such as are they students with disabilities or English language learners, the location of the school. We talked about that before. Title I is a proxy for income. And then we divide school type in a sort of rough way as either public or non-public. So you've got public and then Catholic and other private or parochial schools. So keep that number 16 in your mind, because what we would hope is that for all 16 fields, we would see increases in performance. But I think you can understand that from what I'm already said, that is not what is happening. There are some groups that are increasing and there's some groups that are sliding behind. So let me give you a sense of to what extent are groups moving ahead and to what extent are groups lagging behind. Of these 16, here's what we found when we looked at reading analysis. So remember, there's 16 possible subgroups there. Of those 16, 5 are in a better place. They've gained some ground. An additional 1 is holding steady. Now remember, you have 16 options. If 5 are moving ahead to a better place, and if 1 is holding steady, then sadly what that means is in 10 of the 16 subgroups, we actually saw a decline in performance. And I think you can estimate or anticipate where much of that was. High poverty schools are seeing more of a slide. In fact, just this morning, Our colleagues over at Curriculum Associates came out with their analysis like this, and they saw much of the same thing. Higher poverty kids, kids with many disadvantages already working against them, are beginning to slide further behind in comparison with their peers. And so, at least in terms of reading, we are seeing far more instances where kids are down than they were before. Let's look at it for math. Again, same 16 possible outcomes. Math is a little bit better, which is good news for us, because remember, math is where things were harder hit, because in math, of those 16 demographic groups, 8 of them are gaining some ground, okay? So 8 of them are moving in the right direction, and an additional 2 of them are holding steady, which then leaves 6 that are declining. Now, again, every time we have some kids moving up and some kids moving down, you are extending the performance gap, widening those gaps there. But things are a little bit better in mathematics maybe than reading, which we needed in some ways case to be, because math was further impacted than reading was overall. So those are the kinds of analysis we'll have. We will know for every racial, ethnic, every subgroup, where they started the year, where they are, what kind of change they've seen, how kinds of gaps are being increased there. And these are the additional questions that we will be looking at. We'll be looking at growth during the first half of the year, how that compares, to what extent has the pandemic continued to impact the students of these kids over time, where are they now? Let me give you an example, and I probably shouldn't say this because I'm kind of giving away some of the report. In the fall, what we saw, if you remember, was that rural and small town schools were more impacted. They had dropped more. I'll go ahead and let you know that in this winter edition, what we're seeing is the rural and small town schools have rebounded faster than their urban and suburban counterparts, which makes sense. Getting kids back in a small town in a Midwestern state is not as logistically complex as getting kids back in, say, in Philadelphia or New York City or Dallas or Los Angeles, okay? And so they had experienced more of a drop, but they've also experienced more of a rebound. Their urban and suburban counterparts didn't have as much of a drop, but they have not rebounded quite as much. The overall report will let you know where everybody is come the winter. We'll also have that analysis about in-person versus remote testing. And to go back to the question that was asked earlier, can we say anything about the differences between the instructional models that people are using? In other words, could we show, for example, that students who are receiving in-person instruction are doing better than kids that did remote? Actually, we tried to do that. That has proven incredibly difficult. There are 2 reasons why. Number one, that hasn't even been consistent within most districts. So some districts that started remote went to hybrid or, in person, or started in person and then changed. It has been a moving target, and things have changed throughout the year. The other thing is the information is sometimes very difficult to get. For example, there is a national database that purports to say whether students are receiving in-person or remote instruction. However, the district can only enter one field. So if they are in person for their elementary school, but remote and hybrid for their secondary schools, they can only enter one field. And so it's a very difficult analysis. So the point blank answer to the question is, can we talk about the differences between instructional services? No, we cannot. Not right now. The raw data just is not possible. But ultimately, you want to know, what does this mean for Catholic schools? So there's a question that came in that says, what is the best way to compare how our students are doing in February 2020 versus 2021? That goes back to the URL that I said. I don't want you to just go to renaissance.com/performing and download the report. I want you to go there and watch for the resources, because if you happen to have STAR assessments from us, if you go to that URL and you scroll down just a little bit, there's a document that says STAR to how kids are performing crosswalk. In other words, it tells you exactly how to do that. How do I pull data from my assessment to compare how my kids are doing to the nation. If you're a STAR customer, it tells you exactly what reports and exactly what dashboards to use. And as we are reporting on percentile ranks, even if you don't use STAR, there's some ways for you to do that. So if you go there, there is a document for you to do your fall crosswalk analysis, and there will be a document for you to do this new analysis about how are your kids growing this year. That is exactly what we want people to do, is to use this data as a reference point so that you can know how you're doing in comparison with schools across the country. But you'll notice a little bit of a coloration here. I'm going to show you a couple of slides in orange. And when I'm using these orange slides, these are Catholic and private school specific statements. So what I'm about to say on the next couple of slides applies right to you and your kids. And then there's going to be a color change, and the color change will be back to blue. And back to blue is going back to the big national overall statement here. But let's let you know what we saw overall. Now, again, I can't give you the following analysis because we're doing the final triple check and the report is just about to come out. But let me tell you what we are seeing overall for Catholic schools and other non-public schools. First of all, students who are enrolled in Catholic schools, first of all, did not drop as much last fall as their public school counterparts. Your kids did not drop as much as kids in the public schools did. So that is already cause for celebration. And when we look at growth this year, we use a score called the SGP, or student growth percentile. I cannot reveal for you the exact number of the SGP for students in Catholic schools, but here's what I can tell you. It is greater than 50. And for those of you that know the SGP scores, you know that a 50 means perfectly on par national normal growth. So when I tell you that the SGP for Catholic private schools is greater than 50, what that also means is students who are enrolled in Catholic and private schools have rebounded slightly better than their public school counterparts. So your students did not experience as much of a drop, and they are rebounding more quickly. You put those two things together, and what that means is your students are in a very good position, particularly when they are compared to their public school counterparts. So you didn't have as much drop, and you're having some very, very nice growth this year. But, there's always one of those. And when somebody says, but, you know that there's something that doesn't sound quite as good. Consistently, we are seeing that the worst impacts remain in mathematics, and even in Catholic schools where students did not drop as much and have rebounded quite nicely. Even in Catholic schools, students still are performing several percentile points behind where they typically would have been. So the bad news is your students are still several points behind where they would have been, but the good news is you are at the front of the pack. Other kids in other schools are even further behind. So yes, there is some ground to be covered, but you're in about the best position that there is right now. So a lot of very good news for Catholic schools. Now there's the color change. Okay, so we've left the Catholic, private, and parochial school conversation, and we're going back to the big national picture. Here is what we can say about growth that is occurring this year and what that means for these kids that started this year further behind than most kids started the year. Despite all the challenges, despite all the hardships that schools have faced, it is possible to say that schools are having a very legitimate year. So we hear a lot of stories about teacher morale. When I polled teachers, I would say that 75% or more of them say they do not feel that they are growing things with kids or moving along as fast as typically. But what we can say is, in an overall sense, this is a very legitimate year of growth. It's certainly not the best, but it's not bad either. This is a very solid year of academic performance. But there are some very significant variances in their recovery. That is what I was talking about before, is some groups have moved ahead quite nicely. And while some groups have moved ahead quite nicely, other groups have fallen a little bit further behind. And so we see much wider variety. And if you go back to something that I said before, this in some ways should make sense to you, because last year, March and April and May and June and July and August, all kids were away from school. And then we started school this year, and that took many different forms in many different schools across many different states and many districts and dioceses all over the place. Some were in person, some were remote, some were hybrid, some ran the whole year like that. Others went in one mode and changed. There has been a lot more variety around what has happened with students between the beginning of this year and now than there ever was last spring. We all had the same experience last spring, but we've had wildly varying experiences from the start of the school year today. And those wildly varying experiences have created some of these variances in recovery, which means achievement gaps. And here's the other thing. The kind of growth that we need, what we needed to happen this year to erase all of the impacts of COVID, the kind of growth that we would have to get during this year to erase that, we have never seen in 1 year. In other words, we would have had to have had a phenomenal year of growth this year to wipe away those gaps in performance, particularly those grades 4 and grade 5 drops in math that were 8 to 10 percentile points. It was unrealistic for us to think that this year could wipe it away, even if it was a non-disrupted year. What that means is we are all going to need to take a little bit of a longer view about getting things back academically. So I think it is helpful for us to view what we are going through right now is much more of a marathon than a sprint. We have a race to run, and we're going to have to cover some distance, and it's going to have to take some time. This is not just a sprint that we do throughout the year and everything will be taken care of. And so if you think about it, in many ways, it is taking, in most areas, when we think about where we are now with vaccines and when we think we can return to normalcy, it's about a 15-month period of time where we were really disrupted by this thing. And I would say it's probably going to take about another 15-month period for us to recover. And what I mean by that is, to catch kids up, we need to use this summer. And that's an important element. But we can also do some things during the next school year. And there's a lot of narrative out there about before and after school, or extended day, extended year, and the following summer, the summer of 2022. So if we take this 15-month view and get some above average growth across that time period, then definitely we can close these gaps. So I saw the question there says, data is impacted by how quickly students are back in school. Public schools are working out much more logistical issues. Yes, that is very much, as I was saying, is the smaller the school, the more remote you are, probably the less logistical it was. What a nightmare it was to bring back school, say in Los Angeles or Philadelphia or Atlanta or some major urban setting where it's just a much more complex thing. And that's exactly what we saw. And that's why the rural schools probably saw more rebound than their more urban counterparts. But back to this narrative, the marathon, not the sprint. We need to be thinking about what can we do for kids over the summer, and what might we do, of course, over the course of next year, which looks like it'll likely be a pretty normal year without these disruptions. And then maybe the following summer. And if we get a little bit more growth this summer and a little bit more growth next year and a little bit more growth the following summer, we can wipe away the academic impacts that COVID has wrought. And the good news is the stimulus monies specifically address this. So the latest round, for example, of stimulus money talks about addressing learning loss, and it puts a lot of emphasis on summer learning and extra time. And so I think in this narrative, what the federal government was saying is, we realize it's going to take some extra effort, and we realize it's going to take a while to recover from all of this. So that is where our conversation should shift. We can now begin to a conversation of recovery. What do we do this summer to get a little bit of extra growth for kids? What do we do next year to get a little bit more? And what do we do next summer? And if we can get a little bit of installment of growth across each of those 3 periods, we can make up for these variances that we are seeing. Finally, I just want to announce or make sure that in case anybody has not seen this, there's a free resource that we made available called the Focus Skills Resource Center. If you go to renaissance.com/focus skills, you can download a list of the absolutely most essential skills for progress in reading and mathematics. I've talked about this a lot in several audiences before, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but if you haven't seen it, please go there, because what it tells you is the most important skills for progress in reading and math tailored to your state. You see the URL up at the top, renaissance.com/focus skills with a dash between those two words. And when you get to that landing page, if you scroll down just a little bit, you'll see a blue bar there that links you to a webinar that talks you through how these were developed and how you can use them. These are free for all schools. You do not have to be a customer of Renaissance to access this resource site. There's an online tool that will show you these skills, and there's the ability to download a workbook for either reading and math for your state. In fact, if you scroll down on that page and get to the bottom, there's literally a map of the country. Click on the state that you're interested in. It will pop up and say literacy or mathematics. Click on the subject area that you want, and a PDF will be generated for you right there immediately that will list for you the most essential skills. Because you see, if we know what the absolute most essential skills are, then we can build the fastest stepping path to recovery to catch kids up. So, getting ready to wrap up things here. Wanted you to be aware of that. And that leaves us just a couple of minutes here if there's any additional questions that have come in. Again, renaissance.com/performing for the report. It will be out in just a couple of weeks. And so if you have gone there and downloaded the previous report, you will automatically be sent a copy of the new report. And we will have some webinars. If you go to renaissance.com/webinars, right now, we are slated to do a webinar through the EdWeb platform. My colleague, Dr. Katie McClarty, and I, and she and I will be walking through that report when it is out. So that is later in April. If you want to join us for that, we can get through there. There was also some questions that came in about what would be your recommendations for summer learning in both math and reading. I have a blog that is not up just yet, but soon will be at renaissance.com/blogs. Here's what I can say about summer learning. Well-structured summer learning programs tend to get about 2 months of additional growth, which is substantial. So what I would say is James Kim at Harvard, his work around summer learning around reading says, and the phrase people use is, how do we keep the faucet open, particularly for kids that might not be coming in? One of the most important things for reading is to make sure the kids continue to read over the summer. And so even modest access to books and some recreational reading over the summer will keep kids from sliding and help some kids move ahead. So for reading, think about how to keep kids reading. And for those of you that are Renaissance customers, we've been posting a lot of resources there, particularly our Mayan digital reading platform where kids can take thousands of books home digitally. The other one is a free resource that I will paste in. If you go to freckle.com, you can download the free version of our Freckle Math Practice app. A lot of schools had kids use this last summer, and we had some amazing research that showed when you look at the gaps that most kids developed in mathematics, the kids that used Freckle, even if they used it modestly, they dropped half as much. And those kids that used it even more just didn't drop. There is a free version of that. You can get it to kids, maybe do some math camps over the summer. If you can get in the building, maybe come in once a week and do a little bit of celebration about what kids are working on. Think about ways to keep the learning faucet open. There is one blog there again at renaissance.com/blogs and another one coming with more details about the summer. And so we're all working very feverishly to put out some guides for the summer for you. Extra questions or other questions? And it's not the worst thing to finish a couple minutes early and give you a more humane pass between the two places. So again, do follow us and watch for that. I will tell you, remember, it's not just about summer learning. And I use the term summer learning, and I differentiate that in my mind from summer school. Because summer school might be a required thing for kids. But when I say summer learning, I just say, well, what could we do in terms of a camp or an activity that we could keep kids going? Summer learning And there's also that extra time, the before and after school, the extended day, the extended year. That's also part of the federal funding as well. But what I'm seeing is most districts haven't gotten to that point yet. We're all so busy. Most schools have, worked on planning their summer schools. Maybe right now they haven't thought about what some of their options may be for next year. But again, we have additional blogs, videos, and resources coming for that as well. So watch for that dialogue to evolve quickly, because the good news is, despite the fact that we have a problem in terms of some students' performance, there's also federal money that we can tap into to address it. So that's a better alternative than a problem with no funding.
All right.
And with that, I will thank
Nice.
Sterling and Josh for hosting. Any last things before we get ready to wrap, Sterling?
Yeah, so I'd like to thank you guys for attending this live session here at NCEA 2021. Just please make sure to complete the post-session evaluation and use this opportunity to check out our other live and on-demand sessions, our learning lounges, our virtual exhibit hall, and so much more. We'll see you soon. And if you want to contact Dr. Kearns, you can contact him through the platform.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
Booth. And if you want a copy of that report when it comes out, you can visit the booth. They'll take your information. Be glad to make sure you get it the day it releases.
All right.
Thank you all so much.
All right, we are off stream now.
Thank you. I'll appreciate the help.
Yeah, no problem.
No problem. No problem.
Really great stuff. Me being, I love data. I'm all about data.
That was made for you.
I know, seriously, it really was. I had messaged my wife. I told her, I was like, "Ooh, look at what I'm going to be watching right now." And she's like, "Ooh, that's gonna be great." She's an educator too. She's actually an SLP. The data I'm interested in and I want to find out is, hopefully I'm not taking too much of your time real quick.
No, fine.
See the impact of student work. Like I'm interested to see, like, for example, a first grader would not know the difference between there, and there.
Mm-hmm.
So the impact of parental support during COVID, how much of it was it happening and how much of it is going to be impacting the student learning when they go into the classroom and mom and dad aren't there whispering the answer. And so my hypothesis behind this is that the parents didn't want to, since the parents are doing the teaching, they're taking over the project, they're taking over the learning. They're like, no, that's not the right way to do it. Whereas the teacher allows the student to fail and to misspell words.
Make their way.
Yeah. And so because the parent is doesn't want to be that embarrassed parent, like, oh my God, my child is sending in this type of work. Like, I really think that there's some sort of connection with that. And then a completely different impact, a topic would be the impact of parental support when they go back into the classroom and how these students are going to react when mom and dad aren't there to help them develop.
What is going to be so interesting to watch, Josh, is the real student movements are at KN1. So you have a lot of kids that might have gone to kindergarten this year and they were on the line. So parents said, I don't feel safe about this. Let's wait another year.
Yes.
Washington State reported kids that were with them with kindergarten. A huge number of them did not show up for first grade. The parents were like doing some alternative or something else. So we're going to have this odd little like bubble in student population that's just now starting, and it's going to make its way all the way through. I've also had some reports in some areas. And as much as high school graduation is so important, in some really rural areas, there's some like juniors and seniors in high schools. Their parents have just said, this is too messed up. They're just going to start working. And so